In 1921, in Logan County, West Virginia, the largest labor uprising in American history would take place. 10,000 coal miners would go to war against the local sheriff's department, coal companies, and eventually the United States military. Complete with spies, assassinations, and even aerial bombings, the Battle of Blair Mountain is the largest armed rebellion in the nation's history, besides the Civil War. And I guess also the War for Independence, but it's the largest that doesn't have war in the title. But the Battle of Blair Mountain wasn't just about the battle. It was about years of poor working conditions and abuses brought on by coal companies. So today, I want to talk about how something that began as a union protest resulted in open gunfights, and talk a lot about some of the weird local politics and history that allowed this to happen in the first place. Before we begin, I want to say the Brainwashed collection is only available for like another week and then it's gone forever. So if you want to get in on some of this merch, like the Panopticon shirt and shorts and the Keep Watching fanny pack, then head to the link in the description at wendigoon.shop, and if you decide to support in that way, it means the world, and thank you. And remember, only like a week left, so get it while you can. And if today's topic sounds interesting to you, then stick around after the ad as we talk about a moment in American history that's hard to even imagine. I mean, I guess there's a lot of like fictional stuff about revolutions and uprisings and things like that, but hard to imagine in real life, even though I guess fictional stories are just imagining real life. You get what I'm saying. As someone who's chronically online, I know that eating healthy isn't always easy, or fun. Between traveling, family, and work, it can be tempting to take the option that's cheap and quick. But thankfully, today's sponsor, Factor, has you covered. Factor gives you the flexibility to stay active without succumbing to a cheat meal when you're short on time. Their meals are chef-crafted and dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. And now there's even more Factor to love. They've doubled the size of their menu, so now there's over 80 options to choose from every week. They've doubled their seafood options, they've doubled the high protein options. There's even a meal customization option now that lets you swap one protein for another. They even have new Asian and Mediterranean food options. And on top of being delicious, Factor also helps you stay healthy. Balanced meals with no refined seed oils or no refined sugars. Factor helps you eat smart and takes out the guesswork. Between reading and meetings and recording for this job of mine, Factor has been a massive help to me, and I'm sure it will be to you as well. And if you want to get in on Factor, then now's the perfect time. Because if you scan the QR code or head to the link in the description at factor75.com and use code WendigoonFB50, you'll get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. That is right, half off and free breakfast for a year. Again, that's code WendigoonFB50 at factor75.com or scan the QR code to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad, and thank you to Factor for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description. We are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. To make sense of how the battle began in the first place, we need to talk about some of the working conditions that had people so upset in the first place. I should also mention here that if you're interested in this story, my primary source is The Battle of Blair Mountain by Robert Shogan. The book goes into great detail about a lot of the political events of the time and legislation that led to these conditions in the first place. So if the story sounds interesting to you, I highly encourage you to check the book out. I'll have it linked in the description. For most of civilization's history, coal has been a necessity. And as societies became more industrial, coal grew in demand. That's because coal is used in everything from generating electricity to creating steel, things that are pretty important in a developing nation. Pulling coal out of the ground tends to be the first step in a near infinite chain of energy and commodities. However, it's that pulling coal out of the ground that has historically been not so easy. While modern technology and methods makes it a far safer option compared to what it was, for hundreds of years, coal mining was an incredibly dangerous and laborious process, most of the time consisting on pulling the ore from the earth by hand, working in cramped, musty, pitch-black conditions for hours on end. Mining accidents were incredibly common, everything from falling in the dark cave to being injured in an explosion. Which, injuries and explosions can mean the explosion hit you, the debris hit you, or sometimes the whole mountain fell on top of you. Heck, my great-grandfather was killed in a coal mine when he got crushed to death, while he was working his way through a crack in the earth that he had to crawl on his hands and knees in. He didn't know that there was something above him called a kettle bottom. Kettle bottoms are fossilized pieces of tree within coal mines, most often tree stumps. And they're dangerous because while they look like part of the cave, they're actually not connected to the other rocks around them and are instead just sitting there, while still weighing several hundred pounds. So while working on a coal seam above him, he accidentally freed a kettle bottom and it killed him in an instant. And if you were fortunate enough to not die inside of the mine would probably kill you after you left. Because, you know, spending years underground in minimal ventilation with all kind of particulates floating around in the air isn't good for you. Lung issues like COPD, lung cancer, or black lung were very common. Which, by the way, black lung, also known as coal workers' pneumoconiosis or CWP, is a disease caused by inhaling coal dust over long periods of time. Black lung leads to inflammation and scarring of the lungs. Despite there being signs of it all the way back in 1830, it was not formally recognized by the government until 1969. And it was black lung brought about from working in the coal mine that killed my grandfather, the son of my great-grandfather that was killed in a mine by a kettle bottom. Suffice to say, coal mining was a dangerous job, but one that needed to be done. So you may hear all of that and think, oh, well, at least they were probably paid fairly and treated well, right? Which, you know, yeah, that'd be nice. No, for a period of time around the mid to late 1800s, most coal miners in Appalachia, where coal was most abundant, lived in things called company towns. A company town is a town ran by a company. Hard to believe, I know. Company towns were structured in such a way that every aspect of a coal worker's life would be through the company. They would come to work at the mine and then receive housing in a town located just outside the mine. They would do their shopping at stores provided by the mine. Their kids would go to school at schools funded by the mine. Their entertainment would be whatever the mining company put on, and even the church they went to was whatever the company set up. It was so bad that in most cases, the company wouldn't even pay the workers with money, it would instead pay them with scrip, a currency that could only be used within the company itself. So the company would have workers gather coal that they would then sell and make a profit on, and to the workers, they would just print monopoly money and hand it out as their wages. Then not only does leaving the coal mine, meaning you're leaving your place of work, your place of residence, the place your kids go to school, and the church you go to, but now you don't even have any money to leave with, because all the money you've made is useless outside of the company walls. As the existence of company towns and working conditions within the mines became publicized, groups of people decided to do something about it, and one of those groups was the United Mine Workers of America. The United Mine Workers, or the UMW, was the first big successful coal union within the United States. Unions began to gain prevalence in the United States around the mid-1800s, and while the first coal miner unions began around 1861, they were fragmented and didn't have a lot of power on their own. So in 1890, the major unions combined into the UMW. UMW's goal was simple: to get better working conditions and wages for mine workers. One of the major tenets that UMW continued to push was that workers should be paid with American dollars instead of the aforementioned scrip or monopoly money. The main way UMW would do this was by staging strikes. The UMW was a large organization with a lot of funds, so they would petition for coal miners to join the union, and once enough of them had joined, they would stage strikes at specific mines, forbidding their union members from working. This created a condition where the mine owners now have to negotiate or risk losing business. This was particularly effective in the late 18 and early 1900s when the United States was going through a huge industrial boom, and if any coal company got too far behind on production, they were left in the dust. So around the country, the UMW began to see better wages and better conditions for workers. Or at least they did in most of the country. Pretty much everywhere except West Virginia. See, West Virginia, specifically the southwestern portion of West Virginia, as well as the bordering portion of eastern Kentucky, was home to the most abundant coal crops in the country. Because of that, coal mines were everywhere, as were coal companies and, crucially, coal miners. See, in that part of the country, coal mining was generational. It's what you did, it's what your dad did, and it's what his dad did. Because of that, tragically, poor conditions were just considered a part of life. And because for decades it was the only industry in the region, workers didn't have the option to go elsewhere. So this made union efforts around the region ineffective. Because it didn't matter how many people the union got on board, the company would just turn around and hire non-union members. As a matter of fact, several coal companies were so confident that the union would have no effect that they began to institute something known as a yellow dog clause into workers' contracts. This was a clause that forbid workers from joining the union. Or in other words, when you signed up to work, you wrote on paper that you would never join a union. So for a lot of workers, because remember the company town thing is still in effect at a lot of these coal mines, not only did losing your job mean you were also losing your housing and community, but if you even join a union to try to get better conditions, you lose all of those things too. Not only did these strategies make it near impossible for the union to get anything done in the region, but the efforts of the coal companies also hurt the union elsewhere in the country. Because now anytime they try to stage a strike in another state, the manufacturers can just always buy coal from the non-union mines in West Virginia, making strikes across the country all the less effective. And anytime the union could get enough miners together in West Virginia to stage a protest, it was met with extreme force. The reason for this was the private security system that coal companies would employ called mine guards. Mine guards were, on paper, a security company hired by coal companies to protect their interests. What it most often became was a private police force, doing things like evicting people from their homes or destroying union vehicles or equipment. This was legal because it was under the guise of protecting the company. Just, sometimes protecting the company meant beating up people who might join the union. One of the main groups that contributed to the mine guard operation, at least in West Virginia, was the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. Baldwin Felts began as a detective agency. They were often hired by railroad companies to investigate train robberies. But as train robberies became less popular and workers' strikes became more popular, they switched to stopping those. Baldwin Felts would do everything from standing guard at coal mines with guns to participating in strike breaking, the act of breaking up a workers' strike, and they would most often do this with guns and explosives. It was this combination of factors that would lead to the first big event that would eventually lead to the Battle of Blair Mountain, and that was the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike. In 1912, in Kanawha County, West Virginia, a miners' strike began. This was one of the UMW's first big pushes in West Virginia. They had managed to get enough supporters and enough local leaders to hold a real strike. One of these local leaders was a woman known as Mother Jones. Mother Jones herself is an incredibly influential person in the history of working conditions and unions in the United States. Born in Ireland, at a young age, her family immigrated to the United States. However, tragically, her husband and 4 children all died of yellow fever in 1867, and then 4 years later, her business was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire. From there, she dedicated the rest of her life to helping workers' conditions. This entailed everything from her leading rallies and marches and speeches, to approaching armed guards in the midst of a protest and demanding to be let through. She was instrumental in some of the first child labor laws and was a co-founder of the Industrial Workers of the World, a massive trade union. So during the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, she was on the ground leading a lot of these rallies and protests. Eventually, the union was able to get a lot of local mine workers to congregate at a piece of land between Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, West Virginia. So in response, the local coal companies began to hire the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency to do whatever it takes to break the strike. This began with sabotaging people's vehicles, burning a few homes. Then it escalated to placing snipers around the strike, shooting at people along the fringe of the group. And when the mine workers began to take up their own guns and threaten to fight back, the strike resulted in gunfights. Keep in mind, these mine workers weren't asking for anything egregious. Among their demands included stop blacklisting discharged workers who worked for the union, that the mine operators accept and recognize the union, that they be paid with actual money instead of company scrip, and a check weighman system. At the time, coal miners were paid based on how much coal they produced. So at the end of the shift, whatever coal they had amassed in a cart would be weighed and they would be paid accordingly. However, it was often just one person who worked for the company that determined how much coal you brought in. So if you brought in 2,000 pounds of coal in a day, but the company doesn't want to pay that much, well, then maybe this guy says you just brought in 1,500, 1,600 pounds. So this demand to have a 2-person weighman system is to say a check and balance to make sure the miners are actually paid for how much coal they produced. This was enough for the coal companies to decide to kill them over it. Because after the coal companies managed to lobby with the West Virginian government to declare martial law, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency mounted up a train that the miners referred to as the Bull Moose Special and drove the train along the outskirts of the strike, firing machine guns into the strikers' camp. In addition to this, since the region was under martial law, several of the mine workers that had taken weapons to defend themselves were taken up into military courts and thrown in prison. One of these was Mother Jones, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, after passions cooled and a middle ground was reached between the union and the local coal companies, she would end up only being in prison for 85 days, although during that time she got pneumonia and nearly died. The strike itself began in April of 1912 and ended in July. It's hard to tell between all the violence and malnutrition how many people died in those 3 months, since a lot of people at the time just weren't documented and several families would just bury their own. But most estimates guess it from as low as 12 to well over 50. And while some of those were Baldwin Felts agents who were shot by the strikers, most of that was miners and their families. This quickly established that any improvement in West Virginia coal mine working conditions was going to come at a heavy cost. Over the next decade, small instances of things like this were not uncommon. Several mines would still employ Baldwin Felts as a private security. As mentioned, if you lost your job at the company town, that also meant you lost your housing. And even if around this time several company towns began to pay people with real United States money, everything about being kicked out still applied. So Baldwin Felts was often hired to perform these evictions. As you could imagine, this led to a lot of skirmishes throughout Appalachia. However, after the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike, a lot of this was more subdued in the public consciousness. It would be a one-off story of an event that happened at one mine and wasn't connected to the whole. And problems people had with the mine were certainly put on the back burner during World War I. See, during World War I, the American industry converted over to the war machine. And coal was considered such a needed commodity that coal miners were exempt from the draft. Despite this, over 50,000 miners joined up to fight, and about 3,000 of them were killed. During the war, there seemed to be this sort of unity. Even if working conditions were bad, everyone felt like they were working for the commonality of their country. Even union organizers stepped back to a degree, being more hesitant to start a strike in such a crucial corner of industry while the country was at war. However, when World War I ended in 1918, things got a lot worse. Because during the war, a lot of new mines had opened up to keep up with the rising demand. And once the war ended, all of those miners who had joined to fight were now back in the United States looking for their old job. So that meant there was a plethora of workers and a plethora of mines. So the union had even less pull in an area they already didn't have pull. You could strike at any mine you wanted to, and it didn't matter because that company probably owns another dozen mines around the state, and the buyers could always pick the mines with the cheapest coal, which normally meant the worst working conditions. So in 1920, the president of the United Mine Workers of America, John L. Lewis, decided that enough was enough and they were going to do something about the coal mines in West Virginia. Now, to mitigate the risk of me coming across as so black and white of several of the individuals involved, the coal companies had done a great job at demonizing the union. Anytime the union would hold a strike, it would be framed by the coal company as a group trying to take away from American industry and American prosperity. And any union complaint that was brought about during wartime had the union framed as an enemy to the country. Not only that, but several union leaders were framed as crooks, trying to secure backdoor deals for their strikes, which are actually pocketed funds. Now, I'm also not saying that the union was perfect. I'm sure there might have been some malfeasance going on. I mean, look at more recent union leaders like Jimmy Hoffa of the Teamsters, who we know was in league with the mafia. There certainly might have been some bad actors, but by and large, the goal of the unions was to make coal workers not die as much and also make money that is real money. One side believing unions to be standing for human rights and fighting for the little guy, and the other believing them to be crooks at odds with the nation's progress. Because of this and how relevant it was to the region, several counties in southern West Virginia began to draw battle lines, with some counties' leadership falling in favor of the union and others being staunchly anti-union. A domino effect would begin that would lead to the largest gunfight in non-war American history when John Lewis and the UMW decided to focus their efforts on Mingo County, West Virginia. In early 1920, the UMW began to rally support around Mingo County. Mingo County, just over the Tug River on the Kentucky border, was home to multiple mines, several of which hired union and non-union members. Since there was already a foothold, the union decided to grow their movement there. For one, the union's district in Mingo, District 17, was headed by President Frank Keeney and Treasurer Fred Mooney. Frank was known for delivering fiery speeches, and both him and Fred were well liked in the community. On top of that, local officials in Mingo were supportive of the union. The mayor, Cable Testerman, was a proponent of the Union, as was the sheriff, Sid Hatfield. So the Union enlisted the help of Mother Jones, a woman who had become much more famous following her imprisonment at the previous strike in 1912. So when Mother Jones, a woman who had the nickname of the most dangerous woman in America, began to show up in Mingo County and give speeches, Union and non-Union workers alike came out to listen. These efforts proved a success, and in the beginning of 1920, over 3,000 non-Union workers joined the Union. Now, it's important to mention that while there were instances of open hostility, as in people shooting at each other, at this moment, Union and non-Union members were not in open conflict. Meaning, even though the mayor and sheriff of Mingo were in support of the Union, they did not try to stop non-Union minds from firing Union members or hiring Baldwin Felts. But needless to say, as you can imagine, tensions were high, and it was those tense conditions that led to what would occur on May the 19th, 1920, in Mingo County, West Virginia, in the small town of Matewan. See, one of the coal companies was about to perform a series of evictions on employees they had recently fired. Given that tensions in the region were so high, Baldwin Felts sent 12 of their best men, 2 of which were brothers of Thomas Felts, one of the Baldwin Felts founders. One of these brothers, Albert Felts, led the dozen agents into Matewan. Things got off on a bad foot immediately. The first thing Albert Felts does is approach Mayor Testerman and ask if Baldwin Felts can put machine guns on the roofs of the town, saying it would be useful to the agency if things go south. So this is a guy working as a strikebreaker who is asking a Union sympathetic mayor if they can militarize the town. Mayor Testerman says no, and Albert replies by trying to bribe him. With that, Felts lets it be and goes about his day. That night, the dozen agents began their evictions at the nearby company town. As you could imagine, evictions were a bit of a soft spot. Sure, if your place of work is providing you housing and you lose your job, it makes sense they would want you to leave. But everyone had a problem with agents showing up and acting as bullies, just throwing people's belongings into the street. And while sure, the agents were acting on behalf of the coal company, it was morally dubious to do it with such force. So while the agents are clearing out houses that night, the police chief, Sid Hatfield, decides to do something about it. Sid Hatfield had a reputation of being a bit of a troublemaker. Before he was made police chief, it wasn't uncommon for him to get into fights and wind up on the other side of the law. Because of this, Hatfield himself was a bit of a local legend. He would cut up and party with the rest of them, but make no mistake, he didn't like bullies. So he shows up where the agents are doing the eviction that night and tells them to stop. Albert Felts and the other agents say they're here on behalf of the company, and Hatfield needs to get lost. Hatfield, sensing this may turn into a fight, leaves, and instead waits until the next day when the agents are about to leave town. When the 12 agents arrive at the train station after their job is done, Hatfield shows up with several deputized miners. And with this makeshift posse, he walks up to Albert Felts and says he has a warrant for his arrest, the warrant being for unlawful evictions. Albert laughs and says he has a warrant for Hatfield's arrest. To dispute the matter, Sid Hatfield and Albert Felts begin to walk towards the mayor's office. Well, not really an office. Testerman owned a jewelry store in town, so they were going to his jewelry store. As they're walking through town, both of their respective groups are following in tow. Mayor Testerman sees the group walking towards his jewelry store and meets them out in the street, standing right in front of a nearby hardware store. Now, the following series of events have been debated and he said, she said it into oblivion. What most reports agree happened is that Testerman walked up to the 2 men who were at the front of the pack and asked to see Albert's warrant for Sid Hatfield's arrest. Meanwhile, Hatfield slowly slips inside of the hardware store, still a short distance from Albert Felts and the mayor out front. The mayor, while looking at Albert Felts' warrant for Sid Hatfield, says that it's a farce. And then we don't know exactly what happened next, but what we do know is that people started shooting each other. Others say as soon as the mayor said it, Felts shot the mayor. Others say that Hatfield saw Mayor pull the gun and both fired their guns at the same time, one into Felts, one into the mayor. What is for sure is as soon as someone fired that first shot, everyone else started shooting. That street in Matewan turned into a shooting gallery. Baldwin Felts agents ducking for cover, deputized miners firing from store windows. When the gun smoke cleared, 10 men lay dead. And among those 7 dead agents was Albert Felts and the other Felts brother, Lee Felts. 6 Baldwin Felts agents managed to get away, with several of them jumping across the Tug River and swimming to safety in Kentucky. Which I guess I should clarify, it wasn't 12 Baldwin Felts agents that went. It was technically 13 because it was Albert Felts and then 12 men. If Southern West Virginia was a powder keg ready to blow, then this was the match. What started as a coal company hiring out a business to carry out evictions had resulted in a shootout that killed 7 people from that company, 2 of which are brothers of one of the founders, 2 deputized miners, and the mayor. This instantly became a political firestorm. The Union used this event as fuel for the engine. What better example for how out of control the coal companies are that they hired a gang that shot the mayor. This led to a new wave of resistance all across Mingo County, as several coal miners said, "Oh, we can just shoot those guys." So in the months that would follow, small skirmishes would happen from time to time between Baldwin Felts agents that overstepped their ground with Union men. This defeat was also perceived as a sort of embarrassment for Baldwin Felts. And assumedly, seeing that the emperor has no clothes, a lot of miners continued to sign up with the Union, with a growing spirit of rebellion rising up in the area. Union and Union sympathizers began to stockpile weapons and ammo. Mayor Testerman's jewelry shop was taken over by Sid Hatfield, who converted it into a gun store. But while this event seemed to be a win for the Union initially, it also had the effect of making the companies double down. For example, Police Chief Sid Hatfield was immediately put on trial for the murder of Albert Felts, the trial beginning several months later in January of 1921. But as mentioned earlier, there were so many different accounts of what exactly went down, and Albert Felts was far from an innocent party, so eventually Sid Hatfield was acquitted. With this acquittal, Hatfield was solidified as a hero in the local community. There was a large celebration, and he was carried through the streets of the town when he was released. The Miners' Union saw this and decided to capitalize on it, creating a silent film called Smiling Sid in 1921. This silent film simply depicted Sid Hatfield with several of his followers walking through nearby mine camps, which these mine camps were where people went after they were evicted from their homes and their jobs, effectively tent colonies on the outskirts of town. In many cases, if these people were Union members, they were bankrolled by the Union, and most of these men and their families were destitute and sickly. So showing Sid Hatfield walking through them as a sort of guardian figure was an effective propaganda piece for the Union. The legend around Sid Hatfield only grew from there as well. Either Sid himself or people around Sid said that he was a member of the Hatfield family, like the Hatfields and McCoys. The evidence for this is kind of shaky, and I'm pretty sure it would have required a child being born out of wedlock, so there's no real evidence for it, but at the time, people ate it up. When a new mayor was elected, a new police chief was appointed, so despite losing his title, Sid was then made a constable. And while there isn't explicit evidence of this besides the fact he would be put on trial for it, it's believed that Sid led posses of Union sympathizers in sabotaging anti-Union coal companies. There was a lot of coal mine equipment that was being blown up and burnt down, and a lot of them suspected Sid, as you could imagine. And once again, there's no evidence of it, but I think he probably absolutely did that. However, not every development that came out of this shooting, a shooting that would be known as the Matewan Massacre, not all of them were in the Union's favor. For one, while the Union did everything they could to bolster the public's opinion of Sid Hatfield, the coal companies did everything they could to tear it down. Chief among them being his relationship with the mayor's wife. While Mayor Testerman was alive, him and Sid Hatfield were good friends. And while Sid Hatfield was unmarried, he would often go over to the mayor and his wife's home. After the mayor was killed, Sid Hatfield would marry the mayor's now widowed wife 2 weeks after his death. I don't know anything nefarious happened before the mayor's death. And, you know, back then, maybe that was just a way of her wanting to live with him so she wouldn't be alone and they were friends or whatever. This is also, I believe, how Sid Hatfield came to own Testerman's jewelry store, as it was transferred to the mayor's wife after his death, who is now Hatfield's wife. It doesn't matter if anything shady went on between the two of them while the mayor was still alive or not, because it was enough for the coal companies to work with. Rumors began to sprout up that perhaps what happened in the gunfight is Sid Hatfield shot the mayor so that he could have his wife. Several of these rumors even made themselves known during Hatfield's trial. Although, as his defense attorney pointed out, that would be absurd for him to want the mayor dead, so he stages a series of events where 13 Baldwin Felts agents show up to perform evictions, and then he gets a warrant for their arrest as some super impractical mechanism to kill the guy whose wife he wants to sleep with. But nevertheless, rumors are sticky, and those that disliked Hatfield had all the more reason to do so. Furthermore, this highlighted some of the tactics that the coal companies were employing, namely a man named Charlie Lively who turned out to be a spy for Baldwin Felts. Charlie Lively lived in Matewan and had a restaurant right across the street from Testerman's jewelry store. It turns out he had been an informant for Baldwin Felts for over a year, outwardly professing to be pro-union so that he could get in conversations with people like Testerman and Hatfield, and then reporting back to the coal companies and Baldwin Felts who to look out for. This meant that even among pro-union members, you had to question who you trusted, which every element of all of that creates a lot of paranoia. This was in a county that, as mentioned, had both union sympathizers and company sympathizers. Well, after Hatfield was acquitted, the coal companies decided to double down. About 80% of the local non-union mines began incorporating yellow dog contracts, which, as mentioned, barred people who are getting a job from ever joining the union. And several mines that would previously hire non-union or union members began to fire union mine workers and incorporate yellow dog contracts. So on either side of the aisle, everyone is getting much more entrenched. People are even more steadfast in their resolve, and now they're holding rifles. Stories of small skirmishes or Baldwin Felts abuses or just company overreach made their way through the mountains. And in response, a sort of Cold War began. Now, the first layer of this was destroying assets of the coal companies, as well as destroying parts of the mines itself, like blowing up coal tipples or burning down office buildings. The second order of effect was harassing scab workers. Scabs, or people who worked despite the ongoing strike, were at first encouraged to quit working for the company and then harassed. And if that didn't work, threats were made to keep them from helping the company. It got to the point where the local coal companies were trying to outsource workers. And as workers arrived at the train station in town, union members would be there to greet them and kindly ask them to leave, even offering to buy their ticket home. As a matter of fact, the union was bankrolling these tickets, and in the first 6 months of this strike and protest that resulted after Hatfield's acquittal, spent $14,000 buying return train tickets, which, to put that in perspective, is about $250,000 today. Because of this, would-be strike breakers would have to try to sneak to work at the coal company. So union members and strikers would set up lines around the coal mines themselves, preventing would-be strikebreakers from making their way into the mines. And yes, this entire situation was exactly bizarre to outsiders as it probably is to you now. However, the man the organization sent, Jonathan Spivak, was there to offer legal advice or negotiation assistance, and that is not the stage the people of West Virginia were at. In a letter back to the president of the ACLU, Jonathan said, quote, "The ACLU seemed under the impression that there is some semblance of legal procedure here. There is not. You can't hold a meeting here, get pinched, and then fight it out in the courts. If you try to hold a meeting in the southern counties, you'll never live to see the courts. This state is a powder keg, ready to blow up any minute." While Hatfield was a constable, the sheriff of Mingo County, Sheriff Blankenship, seemed to be a full union supporter and turned a blind eye to some of the union things that were a bit more violent and perhaps not exactly legal. As far as the greater governments around the county level, no one really knew what to do. It wasn't unheard of for coal companies to call on the federal government to help when a strike had gone too far. Or at least, the coal company says it's gone too far. And National Guard or state police forces had been called in before. But now it was a bit harder to do that. Like, sure, the day of the Matewan massacre, there was a big shootout, but that was over as quickly as it started. Everything that's happened since then has been guerrilla tactics. They're sneaking in at night and blowing up company property, not exactly something to call the military over. Also, at the time, the West Virginia government had no real way of handling it. The state police force had only been created in 1919, a couple of years prior, when Governor Cornwall assembled the group in response to another strike that had occurred. But regardless of the force you have, you can't exactly arrest someone who's as gone as quickly as the deed is done. But regardless, the Union was losing favor with the government in and outside of West Virginia. See, while initially they were sympathetic to the workers' plight and working conditions for coal miners, now there were stories of agencies being shot at and people being threatened if they went to work. When the coal mines would lay off workers for joining the Union, these Union members began to burn down and blow up the company towns. While their patience with the Union isn't entirely gone, as far as the government's concerned, there's a lot of property damage and not a lot of coal being made. Because of this, the West Virginia government began to push back on the more violent strikers. If the state police believed they took gunfire from somewhere or said they believed they took gunfire from somewhere, they would step in and arrest all of the men within a given community. Most often, these communities were the aforementioned tent colonies. Add to this reports of Baldwin-Felt mine guards at nearby coal companies abusing workers or kicking workers out were still common. And given that the police were arresting people within the essentially homeless camps of the mine camps, the Union sympathizers began to realize the police were not there to help them. If they wanted something done, they were going to have to do it themselves. This led to something in May of 1921 known as the Three-Day War. All up and down the Tug River Valley, strikers began to raid local coal mines. Most of this involved them encircling coal mines throughout the region, and after getting into a gunfight with the local mine guards, entering the companies and destroying a bunch of equipment. For 3 days along a 10-mile battlefront, Union miners fought against the state police and strikebreakers. This was the first time, at least in Matewan, that day-to-day life came to a halt. I mean, even during the Matewan massacre, like sure, it was a big shootout for like 5 minutes, but then afterwards things went to normal. People went to the store, kids went to school. Not during the 3 days battle. School shut down, store shut down. The only person that was really walking the street was Sid Hatfield. He, heavily armed along with a group of men, would patrol the town waiting for any attack. During one of these patrols, Hatfield came across the superintendent of the Stone Mountain Coal Company. The superintendent was overseeing an unloading at the train station, and Hatfield told him to stop or else he'd be attacked by snipers. So yeah, again, just keep perspective of this whole thing. The constable of the town is approaching the superintendent of a huge coal company saying he has snipers positioned all around, or if not his, he just knows there are snipers all around that will shoot this guy if he keeps trying to operate the company. During the course of the argument, Hatfield struck the superintendent in some way. The superintendent says he was hit with a rifle, while Hatfield said he, quote, just slapped him. Through the midst of all of this, even before the 3-day battle, Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney were doing everything they could to negotiate with the coal companies. But according to them, despite all the violence that was happening, it was getting harder and harder to find a truce. Because the higher emotions got, the less the coal companies wanted to concede any ground. Keep in mind, Keeney and Mooney are the head of the local union. All the strikers are listening to them, and all they want at the negotiation table is things like an 8-hour workday, being paid real money, not dying as much. And all of these are completely unacceptable to the coal companies. However, in the midst of the 3-day war, a more moderate truce for the moment is determined. Martial law will be implemented by the state of West Virginia, and both sides will cool the open conflict. So the police and strikebreakers will quit going in for arrest, looking for trouble, and the union members and strikers will quit, blowing stuff up and shooting people for now. Everyone agrees to this, and almost immediately, the martial law just falls into the coal company's favor again. Like, for example, they instituted a weapons policy that only those with permits, something that not a ton of people had, permits for guns would be allowed to carry them. This meant that there were routine checks on weapons that strikers and union members were carrying, and therefore routine gun confiscations. The police said they would do the same thing to the Baldwin-Felts members or any of the strikebreakers, but they simply never checked for permits, meaning they were only disarming one side of the conflict. So the striking coal miners began to set up weapon stockpiles in the woods. Weapons were traded and positioned in ways for the police to not know. And while they quit shooting each other for a little bit and eventually the martial law subsided, in August of that year, things would get worse than they ever had been. And it began on August the 1st with the trial of Sid Hatfield. During an unrelated trial for some charge Sid Hatfield was hit with, because he got charged with stuff a lot, like hitting the superintendent of the coal company, that landed him another charge. During an unrelated trial, Hatfield finds out that he's wanted in McDowell County for blowing up a coal tipple. Now, McDowell is different from Mingo County because in McDowell, they're not pro-union. And Sid Hatfield had made quite the reputation for himself as a pro-union constable who potentially was blowing up coal company assets. So Hatfield and his attorney called the McDowell County Sheriff's Office, and Hatfield says he will turn himself in to stand trial willingly as long as the sheriff can promise him his safety. The sheriff does, and after Hatfield's initial arrest and then being bailed out, his trial begins on August the 1st. That morning, on arriving in McDowell County, Sid Hatfield was met by Charlie Lively. Charlie Lively being the guy that opened a restaurant next to Hatfield back in Mingo County and turned out to be a spy for the Baldwin-Felts agency. Charlie, who I'm sure Hatfield had no interest in seeing, followed Hatfield around that morning. eventually remarking that he'll see him at the trial. When it came time for the trial, Hatfield made his way to the courthouse along with his friend, Ed Chambers. Ed Chambers was a co-defendant along with Hatfield for blowing up the same tipple. Both of the men were there with their wives, Ed's wife and Hatfield's wife, who is again the widowed wife of Mayor Testerman. As the four of them are making their way up the courthouse stairs, they see standing at the front of the courthouse several Baldwin Felts agents. This on its own isn't entirely unusual. The Baldwin Felts were probably working in the area on the behalf of coal companies, or perhaps they were called to trial as a witness, right? What was odd was that Charlie Lively, the Baldwin Felts spy, and the man who had been following Hatfield around all morning, was standing there with him. And little did Sid Hatfield know that two of those agents were two survivors of the Matewan massacre over a year ago, now standing in front of Sid Hatfield once again. As the four of them made their way up the McDowell County Courthouse staircase, the Baldwin Felts agents pulled their guns and fired. Three agents, two that had survived the Matewan massacre and the spy Charles Lively, killed Ed Chambers and Sid Hatfield on the courthouse stairs. Charles Lively walking up to Ed Chambers, who was still alive, pushing off his crying wife and shooting him in the back of the head. At the same time, a fourth Baldwin Felts agent turned around and unloaded his pistols into the wall of the courthouse, then placing the empty guns on the body of Chambers and Hatfield to make it look like they shot first. Sid Hatfield's wife, Jessie, now widowed a second time by the Baldwin Felts agency, crying, screaming at the agents who killed her husband, said, "We didn't come here for this." And one of the agents replied, "Well, that's all right. We didn't come down to Matewan on the 19th of May for this either." And the agent's plan for the self-defense play worked. On the same streets that Sid Hatfield had been carried away from his last trial as a hero, him and Ed Chambers were now carried in caskets. The funeral was attended by many Union members and strikers. Sid Hatfield was at once a leader and a visionary, and now he was a martyr. Sam Montgomery, friend of Sid Hatfield's and fellow striker, said the eulogy on the Kentucky side of the Tug River, just across the bridge from Matewan. And to this angry, desperate crowd, Montgomery did not mince his words. Quote, "We have gathered here today to perform the last sad rites for these two boys who fell victims to one of the most contemptible systems that has ever been known to exist in the history of the so-called civilized world. Deliberately shot down, murdered in cold blood while they were entering a place which should have been a temple of justice, and by whom? Men who are working under the direction of and taking their orders from coal operators who live in Cincinnati, Chicago, New York City, and Boston. Sleek, dignified, church-going gentlemen who would rather pay fabulous sums to their hired gunmen to kill and slay men for joining a union than to pay like or lesser amounts to the men who delve into the subterranean depths of the earth and produce their wealth for them. At the same time, these same men prate of their charities, their donations to philanthropic movements, act as vestrymen and pillars of the churches to which they belong. There can be no peace in West Virginia until the enforcement of the laws is removed from the hands of private detective agencies and from those of deputy sheriffs who are paid not by the state but by the great corporations, most of them owned by non-residents who have no interest in West Virginia's tomorrow. Even the heavens weep with the grief-stricken relatives and the bereaved friends of these two boys. If the Matewan massacre was the match to the powder keg that was West Virginia, this was forgetting about the match and just throwing a stick of dynamite in there for good measure. Montgomery's eulogy rang true in the hearts of several of the strikers who were looking for a fight anyway. Even the heavens weep. There will be no justice in West Virginia. But even without the eulogy, the events speak for themselves. Sid Hatfield was the Union's guy. He was the strikers' guy, fighting for the common man. When the town of Matewan was in the midst of war with the local police, he walked up and down the streets with a rifle, making sure the town was safe. And now he was shot to death in the next county over, and everyone who was responsible walked away. Up until this point, it can be argued that all the miners wanted was for the companies to be better, for them to be treated with respect, with fair wages. And sure, they still wanted those things, but after Hatfield was murdered, they wanted revenge too. And it was apparent to everyone at this point that something was about to happen. They just didn't know what. Remember how I said a few months previously in May there was a martial law put in place? Well, during that time when they were checking strikers for weapon permits and monitoring the town, They began arresting strikers for all kinds of various misgivings. Things like colluding in sabotage or stockpiling weapons. While several of these guys had been held for several months at stations in nearby counties, some of which were in Logan County, just north of Mingo. Logan County was anti-union, and the sheriff allowed the union strikers who were arrested to be jailed there. While several of these strikers set about heading over to Logan County and raiding the police stations. They would just bust into the station, disarm the police, and break out their guys. Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney get a little panicked. Remember, they have been the voice of the union and the strikers to the coal companies. They've had a lot of meetings that maybe have given a little ground, but no real headway. Well, now people are more concerned about when they get to start shooting than when they get, workers' comp. So Mooney and Keeney plead the union members and the strikers to give, the legal process one last chance, and says what they should do instead of, attacking the police is take their protests directly to the governor's office in Charleston. So Mooney, Keeney, and several hundred miners marched to the capital of Charleston. From there, a series of speeches were heard, impassioned speeches from people like Keeney and Mother Jones. Eventually, the governor relented and had an audience with Keeney and Mooney on August 7th, 1921. In front of the governor, the two men had a broad range of demands. Quoting from Shogun's book here, chiefly for a joint commission of management and labor to adjust wages and mediate disputes, but also for an 8-hour day and the election of check weighmen at the mines. For good measure, the petition also included a statement from the 1920 Republican Party platform pledging, quote, to correct the abuses that have grown up under the so-called private guard or detective system. The last one was a dig because the Republicans controlled the legislature at the time, and that was something they promised to do before they got elected, and oh look, they didn't do that. So stop the mine guard system, have a check system in place for the weighmen, an 8-hour workday, and a system to mediate disputes and pay. The meeting lasted 30 minutes, and Governor Morgan said he would think about it. Walking outside to the demonstrators, Keeney said, "We are going to organize Mingo and Logan County or fill the jails so full they won't be able to feed them." Well, 10 days later, the governor responded by rejecting all demands. Not even a single piece of it, not even a petty we'll give you a little bit of a pay raise. He was just like, nope, none of it. The reason the miners are in Charleston in the first place is because Keeney and Mooney said, hey, let's give this whole not shooting each other one more fair shake. And then they do that, and it wasn't a fair shake. So what does that leave? They've put up with the state police for over a year. Sid Hatfield just died, and the governor said no. So the protesters in Charleston said, all right, we are going to walk to Mingo County and Logan County, and we are going to bust every single striker that has been arrested through this entire thing out of jail. And we are going to bring every bullet and trigger necessary to do it. So their plan is to meet up on the southern border of Kanawha County, send out flyers, rally union miners from every part of southern West Virginia, and march the 50 miles from Kanawha to Mingo. However, there is one hangup with this. To get from Kanawha to Mingo, you've got to walk through Boone and Logan County. The sheriff of Logan County, Sheriff Chafin, is super staunchly anti-union. You know, he let the strikers be jailed there and all. Not to mention, Don Chafin really hates the strikers for disarming his men. So when Don Chafin hears that there is a group of strikers that are going to march with guns through Logan County, he puts together a team of his own deputies, local state police, as well as anyone who's willing to volunteer and hold a gun, and says that the strikers will never make it past Blair Mountain, a mountain at the north end of Logan County. Upon hearing this, the strikers who are about to begin their march are met with protest from Mother Jones. Mother Jones begs the strikers not to march. She says that it'll be a bloodbath and no good will come of it, but Keeney and Mooney says they're resolved to go. So then Mother Jones presents a piece of paper that she says is a telegram from the governor. And the telegram says if they don't march, he will meet all of their demands. This is suspicious because the governor was just talking to Keeney and Mooney and said he wasn't interested. And even if he was interested now, why would he go through Mother Jones to tell them? When they ask to see the telegram, Mother Jones tells them no. Eventually, they get it out of her, and Keeney says that it's a fake. This leads them to think that perhaps Mother Jones is working on behalf of the companies and the governor. And this is a historical note that there's not really any like concise answer on, which I'll be the first to admit I'm not perfect. Shocking, I know. When I do research for these videos, I'm normally learning about all of these characters for the first time. And when I hear about someone like Mother Jones that seems to have been super influential in decades worth of history, it can be hard to know from a single excerpt of her life the whole of her character. While I don't think Mother Jones was a spy the entire time like Charles Lively or some would allege, I do think it's possible that she was just kind of susceptible. According to Shogun, she had a habit of protesting coal companies very intensely, but then after she talks to the head of the company, she's like, well, maybe that one's actually not so bad after all. So perhaps she had a meeting with Morgan and Morgan won her over, even if he wasn't deserving of such. Either way, Mooney and Keeney and now the rest of the strikers threw off Mother Jones' opinion, and beginning on August 20th, the group began to make their way through Boone County. They picked a rally point at the southern end of Boone County, and over the next several days, 13,000 miners would show up. And again, this isn't just a protest. This is 13,000 people with arms ready to be shot at and shoot back. This level of turnout gets everyone real nervous all at once, because it seems to the governor as well as the federal government, this is now a real problem. I mean, sure, it was always a real problem, but 13,000 people is like a small nation's army. And on the other side of the border in Logan County, Sheriff Chafin doubles down. He had garnered a few private planes as well as requested planes from the U.S. military. On top of that, the new president, William G. Harding, had the army on standby to send into Logan County if needed. On the flip side, the Union and strikers were building their own army, but in very non-distinct ways. You remember how I said back at the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike, the train that was used to shoot at everyone was called the Bull Moose Special, you know, a joke about Teddy Roosevelt? Well, these strikers, while in Boone County, stole a train and called it the Blue Steel Special, and prepared to use it as a mobile firing platform and a troop transport. While there was certainly a ton of people already there, several other people were coerced to be there. As if someone was unlucky enough to be driving down the road and come across a group of miners walking to the protest is a strong word, guerrilla army more like. Their car was often procured for them for the sake of the cause, or they were held at gunpoint and made to participate in the strike themselves. Meanwhile, Sheriff Chafin over in Logan County began to station his forces atop Blair Mountain, digging in trench lines and machine gun placements on the ridges. Any advancement directly up the mountain would result in a bloodbath. And Keeney and Mooney, who about a week ago were really hype about marching through Logan County, now have cold feet. Not so much that they had cold feet about the march or breaking people out of jail, more so about the strategy of it, because the miners are effectively walking into a trap. When they get actual cold feet about doing this at all is when the president sends a major to have a conversation with the two men, and the major tells them that if this goes bad and a war breaks out in southern West Virginia, they, as the union organizers who put this group together, would be held responsible. So Keeney and Mooney begin to walk around to the strikers and be like, you know, what is a protest? Like, I mean, wouldn't we rather all just like, you know, go home, be in a mine? Am I right, guys? Remember that? That was fun. And citing concerns for success managed to quell the spirits a little bit. I mean, obviously people are mad and want to do something. They're just convinced that they should wait. Meanwhile, the union that Mooney and Keeney represents, who are given a similar threat by the federal government, offered to buy train tickets for all of the miners to get out of town, and then they can regroup and talk about it later. So on August the 25th, all of the miners that are camped on the southern border of Boone County begin to make their way to local parks and train stations to start making their way out of town. Well, I have a sneaking feeling, based on what's about to happen, that Sheriff Chafin didn't like that answer. See, Chafin also really wanted a fight. You don't enlist every local police force and multiple airplanes unless you need something to go down. I mean, you dug those battle trenches on the top of the mountain. You might as well use them. So when Sheriff Chafin hears that the protesters are starting to disperse, he thinks now would be a perfect time to serve a few warrants. So on August the 25th, he sends a group of his deputies to the nearby town of Sharples, where he has a warrant for some strikers who were apparently a part of the disarming of Logan County officials like a month ago. His deputies go up there to serve warrants, and sure enough, a gunfight happens in which 2 miners are killed and another is shot. So, almost instantly, the 13,000 miners on the southern end of Boone County who were about to go home hear that the sheriff of the next county over that they were about to get into a fight with just killed 2 miners and shot another. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. There was absolutely no coming back from this. They really wanted to fight, and they were about to do it right now. Keeney and Mooney wisely got out of town. And another union organizer, Bill Blizzard, who wanted to fight as much as all the other miners, stepped in as a figurehead to take charge. At this point, Sheriff Chafin was also getting financial backing from the coal companies that were in Logan County, several of which hiring Baldwin Felt's agents to work with the sheriff in defending against the oncoming miners. Exact estimates are not known, as some of the miners still probably left after August the 25th. But roughly 10 to 12,000 miners still pushed into Logan County, where Sheriff Chafin was waiting with 2,000 to 3,000 armed men. What would follow is, once again, the largest armed conflict in the United States, aside from the Civil War, or the Revolutionary War. You get it. So the strikers, now being commandeered by Bill Blizzard, are a full-blown irregular army making their way into Logan County. On the way, several of them sang a chant set to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I mean, I can't sing, but I guess I have to sing what they were singing, right? Okay. Every little river must go down to the sea. All the slaving miners and our union will be free. Going to march to Blair Mountain, going to whip the company, and I don't want you to weep after me. You're welcome. With some singing a rendition that ended with, we'll hang Don Chafin to a sour apple tree. Now, the men weren't uniformed, but they had running passphrases and ways of identifying themselves. The way running passwords work is there is a challenge and then a response. So if you're in the battlefield and you see someone and you're not sure if they're on your side or the enemy's, you say a challenge or the start of a phrase, and the other person is supposed to finish it. If they don't finish it, well, then you can start shooting at them. The miners had 2 passwords, and keep in mind most of them had knowledge of this, as many of the miners were veterans of the First World War. The first challenge was, "Where are you going?" to which the correct response was, "To Mingo." The other challenge was, "How are you coming?" and the response was, "I come creeping." That goes so hard. For uniform, some people had the United Mine Workers insignia, with several of the women, which were mostly wives and daughters of the men who were prepared to fight. Several of the women who were there to act as nurses wore the insignia on their caps. The other identifier that the miners had was a red bandana. Bandanas were commonly used in the mines as sweat rags, or if you tied it around your face, it was the only protection your lungs got. So many of the miners, prepared for battle, tied their red bandanas around their necks. And this is where we get the popularization of the term redneck. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't where the term began, as the term originally came from Scottish rebels in the 17th century who wore red cloth around their neck to protest against English rule. And there's some evidence that the term redneck was used to describe field workers who would get sunburns across the back of their neck. But this was the first time that the term was used to describe working class or lower class people within the southern United States. On the other side, Sheriff Chafin's forces wore uniforms as well. The men dressed themselves in khaki and wore white armbands. They also had running passwords, the passwords being Holden and Amen. By August 30th, the miners had arrived around the foothills of Blair Mountain, as well as several small towns around Blair Mountain in northern Logan County. The fight would kick off that morning when Sheriff Chafin's head deputy, John Gore, and a couple of his men were doing their patrols around the base of the mountain. It was then that they ran into a group of miners. The two groups began yelling back and forth, asking who the other was, before the miners asked for the password. Chafin's men replied with Amen, their password, and were promptly shot by the miners. 2 of the deputies were killed instantly, and the third was executed by one of the miners who, before he fired, said, "That's for Sid." With this, the Cold War went hot and the battle raged through the first week of September. Several of the miners engaged in bump and run tactics. After one of Chafin's machine gun emplacements was discovered, miners would take pot shots at the position before disappearing into the woods, miners pushing forward until they were met with too heavy of resistance and falling back. Meanwhile, Chafin not only employed the use of machine guns, but snipers. Several waiting on choke points they expected miners to pass through, and then being fired upon before the snipers would relocate. Also, remember those private planes that Chafin had got a hold of? Well, these planes would be flown over regions where miners were expected to be, which, mind you, was mostly countryside as well as houses and communities that were suspected of being sympathetic with the miners. Several of these planes would drop early iterations of tear gas, and others would drop pipe bombs. Now, while it seems like the pipe bombs didn't have a huge effect, one hit someone's house and another landed between two women that were washing clothes by the river, but thankfully, the pipe bomb did not go off. The military planes mentioned earlier were used for surveillance of miners' positions, but they never deployed weapons. I've heard people mix the two facts about planes dropping bombs and military planes being used to say that the military bombed American civilians here, which, not directly. The military planes were used against the American civilians as in surveillance, and the planes that dropped bombs were private planes commandeered by the sheriff. But since the sheriff was acting on behalf of the military or in the favor of the military, then you could kind of say that it still counts. The battle lines across the northern border of Logan County were nonstop. Throughout the night, guard patrols would trade shots with muzzle fire across hilltops. The miners would clear out machine gun positions only to be met with another. Every time ground was gained somewhere, it was lost somewhere else. After a couple days, the miners began to destroy bridges or other avenues of transport, attempting to bottleneck any advancement that the sheriff's men could make into their positions. And eventually, the miners tried to take the nearby towns surrounding Blair Mountain, although these were equally defended. One reporter who was there recounts seeing several miners push the sheriff's forces out of a trench, only to fill that trench with their own forces before they get torn apart by an until then hidden machine gun placed perpendicular to the trench. And that leads to one of the big reasons that the Battle of Blair Mountain was as unsuccessful for the miners as it was: a lack of organization. Sure, a lot of these men were willing to fight, and a lot of them had combat experience, but there was no greater directive other than let's walk that way. Bill Blizzard was leading the charge, sure, but I mean, he was literally saying, yeah, guys, let's go that way. There was no tactician, there was no chain of commands, there was no upkeep as to where they should push or where they should dedicate resources. And meanwhile, the defenders in Sheriff Chafin had exactly that. Not to mention the military assets and leaders that were sent in to assist him in the first place. The miners had the gumption and the manpower, but they didn't know what to do with it. Colonel William Eubanks of the National Guard was a huge asset to Chafin. It's not only a lot of the logistics, but the strategy came from him. Ultimately, the Logan County forces were able to keep the miners back for several days, and it was all over by September 4th when the military showed up. See, as soon as the battle kicked off in earnest on August 30th, the military was on their way. They didn't start arriving until September 2nd, and by September 4th, they were all there. The miners never attempted to fire on United States soldiers. Several of them were soldiers themselves. They viewed the coal companies of being at fault, and the local sheriff's departments and police departments as being in cohorts. Several of them saw the arrival of the military as salvation, hoping that the government would bring some sense to this lawless system. But of course, the soldiers were just there for the miners. As miners surrendered themselves to the U.S. troops, word got out that they were confiscating weapons. So most of the miners began to hide their weapons in the woods before they stepped in front of the troops. About 1,000 miners formally surrendered to the military, and way more than that just disappeared. I mean, you were never formally there in name anyway. If you can just walk away, that's probably the best option, especially in a time before security cameras. To put it in perspective, only 400 guns were turned in, which goes to show how many were buried in the hills somewhere or went away with the people who brought them. Now, the number of people that were killed in this battle will never be known, mostly because it seems both sides dragged away their dead, perhaps trying to save them, thinking they were injured, perhaps not wanting the other side to know they were experiencing losses. But on either sides of the conflict, no one really kept count, and it seems that, again, families just buried their own. Because of that, the official kill estimates are laughably low. On the high end, you'll hear like 100 across both sides in a conflict made up of like 15,000 people. And the lowest number I've seen is 13, which I guess 3 of those were the 3 cops killed at the kickoff of this. And you're telling me through a week of constant gunfire, only 10 more people got hit? I mean, there are several journalists who write about seeing bodies on each other, or like the account I mentioned earlier of a whole trench of people getting lit up with a machine gun. I will say that several of the people who fought in the battle said it was really difficult to get a hit because the underbrush was so thick. Like, they would know where people are and they would keep firing, but they weren't able to make contact. The bullets kept getting deflected. But it's gotta be way more than 100. I don't think it would hit like 1,000, but 200 or 300 at least. As soon as the battle was over, this was the worst press the Union had ever received. Because again, it was already kind of a divisive political issue. And now the Union had been given a chance, and their two leaders had led 13,000 men to get into a fight with the military. Because of that, the Union plummeted in the years following. Over the next few years, the UMW's membership went from 50,000 to like 10,000. They wouldn't unionize Southern West Virginia until FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression. And as for the people that participated in the battle, the government wasn't too happy with them either. Initially, passions were really high and they wanted to like arrest everyone they could, but that became difficult because it was hard to tell how many people actually participated in the gunfight versus were just around it and maybe provided supplies. And again, some people were forced at gunpoint to be a part of the fight. Initially, they threw out indictments on 985 people, but almost all of those fell off instantly. And ultimately, only a handful of people were experiencing any real charges. Those charges, however, were treason. For one, it was very smart of Keeney and Mooney to get out of Dodge when they did. Since they weren't there for the actual battle, they weren't able to be charged with anything, at least related to this. However, people like Bill Blizzard and a few of the more well-known organizers were charged with treason against the state of West Virginia. However, as their trial began, this presented an issue for the prosecution, because according to the West Virginia Constitution, quote, treason against the state shall consist only in levying war against it or in adhering to its enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. Now, no one's arguing that they didn't commit violent acts. That is very clear. But it was not against the state of West Virginia. It was against the coal companies and agents acting on their behalf. Sure, the agents were supplied with state assets, but these strikers, as the defense argued, went all the way to the Capitol, and when they didn't get what they wanted, turned around and left. If they had staged and started the Battle of Blair Mountain in downtown Charleston, then yeah, that would probably be treason. But it was very clear their beef was not with the government, it was with the companies. As the New York Times declared while covering the trial, quote, in West Virginia, indictments for treason seem to be thrown about as carelessly as if they were indictments for the larceny of a chicken. That had to be a new sentence when it was said. Ultimately, a few men were sentenced to lighter charges related to destruction of property or violence. But by 1925, only 4 years later, everyone was out of jail. In their march, they never managed to make it to Mingo County and free the people that were being held during the strike. But as passions cooled, all of them were released as well. While initially the Battle of Blair Mountain served as a discredit to the Union and the workers whose condition was so terrible it pushed them to this place, as our retrospect grew, history saw it as a desperate people. And because of that desperation and the determination of what they did, things got better. As mentioned, 15 years later during the New Deal, Southern West Virginia was unionized. And as technology and methods and practices got better, mine workers were paid a comparatively better wage, and the occupation fell away from the death sentence that it once was. As Sid Hatfield's tombstone reads, he, along with many of the other protesters, were defenders of the rights of the working people, defenders that we should never forget. The Battle of Blair Mountain is a fascinating point in history, one that's hard to imagine given where we are now. And maybe you feel that it's something worth remembering, or maybe just a cool story, and either way, I just want to say thank you for watching. The Battle of Blair Mountain is such a strange tale. Growing up in coal country, I would hear like whispers about it from time to time. People would make jokes about, oh, well, if the company keeps this up, they're going to have a Blair Mountain on their hands. And of course, it just served as a testament of resolve for the people. People who were so desperate and afraid that this cycle of death was going to keep going that they were ready to die for it right now. It's such a fascinating story and one that I really wanted to talk about. And again, thank you all for listening to me yap about it. There's a lot of people who talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain online, but they just talk about the battle like they opened with. And then there were a group of like miners who were really mad at the coal company. So they start marching from Charleston, and it's like, whoa, why, why were they in Charleston in the first place? Who's Mother Jones? Who's Sid Hatfield? Like, I think it makes more sense as a continuous narrative, and hopefully it was interesting and not a complete bore. Yeah, this is just a fascinating story, one I wanted to talk about. And again, thank you all for being here. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, the Brainwashed collection is here for like less than a week now, maybe like 6 days. So this is your last chance. Link in the description at wendigoon.shop. I appreciate the support. If you guys pick it up, you know, it really helps me, means the world. I understand that things are a bit expensive. Tariffs are not cool and lame. And I apologize for things being the way that they are. If you want to support but can't, I totally understand. Do not feel obligated to whatsoever. But if you choose to and are able to, it means the world. But like I said, totally understand. Thank you guys for your support over on Wendigang. It's been crushing it over there. Very cool to see. There's been a lot of stuff going on lately. People are talking about on YouTube that like views have tapered down across the board. Some changes they're instituting on like their side of things on the platform side. And I've talked to some people at YouTube and they're aware of the issues. And I've kind of seen that on Wendigoon, but on Wendigang, it's like never happened. I guess you guys are supporting it so hard over there that it's negating whatever issue YouTube has, which is awesome. You guys are incredible. So thank you all for that. Like I said, if you're interested in reading about the book that I used as a primary source for this video, it will be linked in the description as well. All in all, I believe that should do it for now. New content soon to come. But before I go, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. You know, I have multiple red bandanas. I should have wore one for this video. Dang it.